November, 1177. The plains of Ramla, in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In the Holy City, a crown rests on the head of a boy, King Baldwin IV, only 16 years old. His body ravaged by leprosy, his face scarred, his hands weak. He was told he would never live to rule. And yet, he carried the weight of a kingdom on the edge of destruction. Beyond the horizon, fires lit up the night. An army of 26,000 men stretched across the plains. At their head rode Sultan Salahuddin, conqueror of Egypt, master of Syria, and the most feared commander of his age. One was a frail boy king, clinging to life. The other, a warrior sultan commanding an empire. And on this battlefield, their destinies would collide. So before we dive in, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the untold chapters of history. It really helps us keep going, and I truly appreciate all of you for tuning in. To understand this clash, we must go back. Two men, two worlds, born in different lands, yet destined to meet on the battlefield. Salahuddin was born in 1137, in the fortress town of Tikrit, on the banks of the Tigris. He grew up in the service of Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Syria. Through loyalty and skill, he rose quickly. By 1169, he was appointed vizier of Egypt. Within 2 years, the centuries-old Fatimid Caliphate was gone, and Salahuddin had restored Egypt to Sunni rule. Step by step, he united Egypt and Syria, bringing the Muslim world closer together under his banner. Far to the west, in Jerusalem, a boy was born in 1161. Baldwin, son of Amalric, king of Jerusalem. His childhood was marked by a cruel disease. At the age of 9, it was discovered that he could not feel pain in his arm. The diagnosis was leprosy, a death sentence in the Middle Ages. Yet fate placed the crown on his head at just 13. Despite his illness, Baldwin refused to be a figurehead. Against the advice of many, he trained for war, learned to ride, and took command of his knights. One was building an empire, binding divided lands together. The other was holding a fragile kingdom, his body failing even as his will grew stronger. Two lives, two paths, set on a collision course. In 1174, the balance of power shifted. Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Syria, was dead. His sudden passing left a vacuum, and Salahuddin moved swiftly to fill it. He first secured Damascus, then pressed northward. Aleppo, Homs, Hama, Mosul. One by one, he drew the emirs of Syria into his orbit. Through war, diplomacy, and patience, he tightened his hold on the region. Egypt was already his. Now, Syria too was falling under his command. By 1176, Salahuddin had forged the strongest Muslim coalition seen since the Crusades began. For the first time in decades, the fractured lands of the Middle East were being united under a single banner. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, King Baldwin IV fought simply to keep his kingdom alive. Despite the weakness in his limbs, he rode out at the head of his knights, leading defenses against constant raids. Each victory was a reminder to his people that their young king, though ill, would not surrender. But the storm was rising. With Egypt and Syria united, Salahuddin's gaze turned west. Beyond the frontier, beyond the desert, one city stood as his ultimate prize, Jerusalem. In the autumn of 1177, Salahuddin made his move. With nearly 26,000 men, he crossed into the kingdom of Jerusalem. His plan was bold: march through the coastal plains, cut off Jaffa, and strike at Jerusalem itself. The kingdom was unprepared. Most of its forces were scattered. King Baldwin IV could summon barely 500 knights, supported by a few thousand infantry and the warrior monks of the Templars. It was not a battle of equals, it was survival itself. Baldwin's body was weak. His disease had worsened. He could no longer mount a horse without help, yet he refused to hide behind the walls of Jerusalem. Instead, he gathered what men he could and marched to intercept the Sultan. Step by step, the two armies moved closer. On one side, the vast columns of Salahuddin, cavalry, archers, banners stretching across the horizon. On the other, a small, desperate force, led by a boy king who could barely lift a sword. The clash was coming. And no one believed Jerusalem could stand. November 25, 1177. Salahuddin advanced across the coastal plains of Ramla, his banners stretching as far as the eye could see. He commanded nearly 26,000 men, cavalry, infantry, and seasoned archers, an army thought to be unstoppable. In his mind, Jerusalem was already within reach. Victory was expected. confidence filled the Sultan's camp. But Baldwin IV refused to yield. Gathering what little strength he had, he mounted his horse, carried into battle by sheer will and the hands of his knights. At his side rode the Templars, hardened veterans sworn to fight to the death. Behind them marched a few thousand foot soldiers, outnumbered nearly 10 to 1. At the heart of their column gleamed the relic of the true cross. For Baldwin's men, it was not only a relic, but a living symbol of divine protection. To them, it was as if God himself marched with them into the field. As Salahuddin's men moved forward, spread thin by their confidence, Baldwin saw his chance. With no time to waste, he ordered the charge. 500 knights thundered across the plains, lances lowered, sunlight flashing from their armor. The ground shook beneath their horses. Their war cry echoed through the valley. It was a desperate gamble, one strike to shatter the heart of the enemy. The clash was sudden and brutal. The small crusader force tore into Salahuddin's vanguard, cutting deep into lines unprepared for such ferocity. Panic spread quickly. Soldiers who had expected an easy victory found themselves surrounded by screaming cavalry. Dust filled the air. Blades clashed. Salahuddin's troops began to break. Many fled, abandoning the field. Others were cut down by Baldwin's charging knights. The Sultan's great army, stretched and scattered, collapsed under the weight of a smaller, desperate force. At the center of the chaos, Baldwin raised the true cross high, urging his men forward despite his own failing body. The sight of their king, ravaged by leprosy yet fearless in battle, drove his soldiers to fight harder. By nightfall, the plains of Montgisard were littered with the dead. Thousands of Salahuddin's men lay fallen. His dream of marching on Jerusalem had been crushed. The Sultan himself barely escaped, protected by his guards, fleeing with only a fraction of his army. For the first time, Salahuddin, the conqueror of Egypt, the master of Syria, had suffered a devastating defeat. But this was not the end. Salahuddin's power was not broken, only shaken. The boy king had won the day, but his body was failing, and time was against him. The Sultan had been humbled, but not defeated. He would return. Montgisard had been a bitter lesson for Salahuddin. The Sultan, who had once seemed invincible, had seen his army scattered by a boy king. But he was not a man to fall into despair. Defeat became his teacher. Over the next years, he transformed his forces. He rebuilt his cavalry, tightened discipline, and ensured his commanders worked as one. No longer would his men march carelessly, spread thin and overconfident. He secured the loyalty of the Syrian emirs, offering them stability, honor, and the greater cause of unity. The Sultan's vision of a united Muslim front was once again alive. In Jerusalem, the picture was far bleaker. Baldwin IV was still king, but his body was breaking down. His vision dimmed, his hands curled with disease, his strength drained with each passing season. Where once he had led his knights from the saddle, he now had to be carried into battle on a litter. Day by day, the kingdom leaned more heavily on regents, nobles, and the ever-restless Templars and Hospitallers. In 1179, the fragile balance broke. Baldwin marched north with his forces to meet Salahuddin at Marj-Ayun, near the hills of Galilee. This time, the Sultan was prepared. His cavalry swept down on the Crusaders with precision. The Frankish knights, so formidable at Montgisard, were encircled and crushed. Many were slain, and Baldwin himself only escaped with difficulty. The aura of invincibility that Montgisard had given the boy king began to fade. That same year, the Crusaders built a massive fortress at Jacob's Ford, directly on the River Jordan. Its walls were meant to guard the frontier and block Salahuddin's path into Galilee. It was a bold move, and an open challenge. Salahuddin responded without hesitation. He marched swiftly, surrounding the fortress before it was completed. After days of fierce fighting, the garrison was overwhelmed. Hundreds of defenders were killed, others taken prisoner, and the unfinished fortress was leveled to the ground. The ruins at Jacob's Ford became a symbol. No line of stone would stop the Sultan's advance. But Salahuddin's victories did not stop at Jacob's Ford. Raids into Galilee and the coastal plains continued year after year, bleeding the Crusader kingdom. His armies struck deep, testing every frontier, burning crops, and forcing Baldwin's men to defend on every side. By 1182, Salahuddin had restored his prestige. His enemies once again feared his name, and even Baldwin's allies began to admit that the Sultan's rise could no longer be contained. The Leper King's courage had bought Jerusalem time, but time was running out. The Sultan had been humbled, but never defeated. Now he was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. By the early 1180s, King Baldwin IV was no longer the youthful knight who had stunned the world at Montgisard. The disease that had marked him since childhood now consumed him. His face was disfigured, his sight nearly gone, his body weakened to the point that he could not even mount a horse. And yet, when the banners of Jerusalem were called to the field, Baldwin still led them, carried upon a litter, crowned in gold, the true cross before him. The sight of the Leper King inspired awe. To his soldiers, he was the embodiment of courage, a man whose body was failing, yet whose spirit refused to yield. Even Salahuddin, Baldwin's great enemy, is said to have respected his resolve. But courage could not halt time. In 1183 and 1184, the struggle between the Crusader barons deepened. Rivalries and ambitions pulled the kingdom apart, while Baldwin's strength slipped further away. He could command, but he could no longer enforce. He was king, yet others ruled in his name. In 1185, at only 24 years old, Baldwin IV's battle finally ended, not on the field, but in his chamber. The Leper King, who had defied death again and again, succumbed at last. His funeral in Jerusalem was mourned by knights, priests, and peasants alike. For all his suffering, Baldwin had been the kingdom's shield, but with his passing, that shield was broken. A child was placed upon the throne. Nobles quarreled, factions grew restless, and beyond the kingdom's fragile walls, Salahuddin was watching. Jerusalem was vulnerable. The Sultan was ready. With the death of Baldwin IV, the kingdom of Jerusalem fell into chaos. Child rulers, rival regents, and ambitious barons quarreled for power. Instead of unity, there was division. Instead of resolve, there was arrogance and greed. The fragile kingdom Baldwin had held together with sheer will now began to crumble from within. Salahuddin saw his moment. For over a decade, he had prepared, building alliances, strengthening his armies, and uniting Egypt and Syria under his banner. Now, at last, the hour had come. In the summer of 1187, the two great forces met at the Battle of Hattin. The Crusaders, lured into the arid hills of Galilee, marched beneath a burning sun. Salahuddin's cavalry surrounded them, cutting off their water, harassing them day and night. Thirst, exhaustion, and despair crushed the once proud army. On July 4th, the decisive blow fell. Salahuddin's warriors encircled the Crusaders near the horns of Hattin. The true cross, carried into battle as a divine shield, was seized. Thousands of knights and soldiers were slain or taken prisoner. The proud military orders of the Templars and Hospitallers were shattered. The kingdom of Jerusalem had lost its sword, but Salahuddin's greatest triumph was still ahead. That October, his banners rose before the walls of Jerusalem itself. This time, there would be no Montgisard, no miracle to save the city. After a short siege, the defenders surrendered. And then, the world witnessed why Salahuddin would be remembered not only as a conqueror, but as a hero. There was no massacre, no river of blood, no slaughter of innocents, as had happened when the Crusaders first captured the city in 1099. Instead, Salahuddin granted terms. The citizens were ransomed, many were allowed to leave in peace. The holy sites were protected. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque were restored to Muslim worship, but Christian pilgrims were still permitted to visit their shrines. In victory, the Sultan showed mercy. After decades of bloodshed, Salahuddin had fulfilled his vision, a united Muslim world, and Jerusalem once more under the crescent. His triumph was not only on the battlefield, it was in the legacy of justice, honor, and restraint that even his enemies would one day admire. Two men, two destinies. Baldwin IV, the Leper King, stricken by disease, yet never surrendering. He defied every limitation of his broken body, leading his people with courage that still echoes through history. His life was short, his kingdom fragile, but his spirit remains a symbol of defiance in the face of despair. And then, Salahuddin, the Sultan. Patient in vision, relentless in resolve. From the banks of the Nile to the walls of Aleppo, he united a fractured world. At Hattin, he shattered the Crusader armies. At Jerusalem, he triumphed not only through steel, but through mercy. His victory was not only territorial, but moral, the victory of restraint, honor, and justice. Their clash was not merely of armies, but of wills. One king consumed by illness, the other driven by destiny. History remembers them both. but it was Salahuddin who became legend. Who do you think was the greatest hero, Baldwin IV or Salahuddin? Comment below and tell us your thoughts. And while you are there, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and thumbs up. It really helps us keep going, and I really appreciate all of you for tuning in. I will see you in the next video where we will uncover another chapter of history.